Hi, I'm Sean Stone. Most of us remember where we were on September 11th, 2001. 3,000 lives were lost. But in the 12 years since then, it's become a bit of a blur. The chaos of wars, paranoia. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been taken in retaliation for that event. Millions more have been affected, displaced, traumatized, mostly far from our eyes here in America. 2 years ago, we're told that the villain behind the terrorist attacks of 9/11 was killed, and yet the wars go on. Many people have questioned the narrative of 9/11. Some have done films like Loose Change and Core of Curruption. More and more people are waking up to the possibility that the narrative doesn't quite add up. That if the real terrorist behind 9/11 is dead, and his network is amorphous, opaque, difficult to figure out, then perhaps there's a different story that needs to be exposed, a different truth. Because if 9/11 is not the work of Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network, if there were other forces at work that day, then how can we justify what has occurred for the last 12 years in this perpetual war of terror? So joining us today on Buzzsaw, we'll have the filmmakers, Jonathan Elenoff, who did the Core of Curruption documentary and also published the New World Order report, and Dylan Avery, who directed the world-famous Loose Change documentary series. So stick around and let's have an interesting conversation about 9/11. This is Buzzsaw. So joining us today is Jonathan Elenoff. You did a documentary called Core of Curruption that came out in 2009. And Dylan Avery, Loose Change first came out in 2005. Now it's on Netflix as An American Coup. And of course, my co-host and accomplice in crime over there,
yes,
Tyrell Ventura.
Yes.
So all of you, obviously, we've all been affected by 9/11, but you've all engaged. Tyrell also produced an episode on conspiracy theory with your father, Jesse Ventura, that went into 9/11. And then also this past season, we did an episode on death ray, which again delved into the question of 9/11. So I think a good place to start, from my point of view, is when did you feel that 9/11 could have been something more than the official story was telling us? At what point did you kind of feel like there was something off in the narrative?
You want to go first?
Why don't you go first? Because your film was definitely predates mine. So.
Fair enough. I think that initially when the attacks first happened, all I wanted to know was how something like this could have happened in my own country. I was graduating, or in the process of graduating high school at the time. I was about to enter into the world, so to speak, and for me this was a bit of a wake-up call that the world I was entering, wasn't all sunshine and flowers and all that. So I didn't point at it immediately and think there's something up with this and I need to investigate it. It was more of just kind of like a subconscious doubt, and I didn't really act upon it until May of the following year, after I started researching for what was supposed to be a fictional narrative script about 3 teenagers finding a cover-up of some sorts about 9/11, and my first thought was, like, if I'm going to write about something, I need to know about it and I need to have as much information at my disposal as possible. So I started researching 9/11. At that point, the information was still very limited, and we were still, as a country, and I think a lot of people in the government were still trying to figure out what exactly had happened. And it was around that time when the NORAD timeline started coming out, and we started getting actual response times for our military's scrambling, or lack thereof, on that date. So I think for me, it was just the simple fact that A, the attacks even happened, and that B, nobody was really in a rush to stop them when they were happening. And that's not to cast negligence upon NORAD. I mean, it was obviously a very confusing day, but there were just a lot of things about that day that for me fundamentally didn't add up, and I felt like I needed to at least look into it and try to dig up as much information as possible. And it seemed like the further I looked and the deeper I dug, it just got worse and worse. And then once video of Building 7 came out, I mean, that was it for me.
The third building that was never hit.
Yeah.
Jonathan?
For me, that summer of 2001, I was actually in Israel for a military program. And I was there actually for interesting circumstances. I was there as a disciplinary action for getting caught in high school distributing weed to my friends, and my dad wanted to straighten me out, if you will. And so he sent me out to this military program out there, and I had just come back from Israel experiencing training in counterterrorism out there, and so I had a pretty distorted worldview of what the world was like outside of the U.S., fed to me directly from one viewpoint. And then seeing the towers being hit in that whole day, I was just like, I just came back from this. Why, it's over here. And so, I mean, for me, it was just a personal struggle with both my issue that I saw in Israel, which was very civil rights based. I identified with both sides very quickly. I saw media issues. I saw things out there that I didn't agree with, and that's actually why I knew my disciplinary commander so well, because I disobeyed orders, and I was like, this is wrong. I don't believe this is how this needs to be done. And so as soon as 9/11 happened, it rung with me like, okay, this is a very serious problem that we're facing here. And
you saw it as a foreign attack. I mean, because the Israelis have oftentimes been the most vociferous in stating, you see, this is what happens to us all the time, and we've been warning you that the Arabs are dangerous and Muslims are dangerous, and they're going to do the same kind of activity of terrorism that we experience every day.
That's exactly right. Yeah, my experience out in Israel was to see that and prove it wrong, more often than not. What I was seeing in Israel was the media was biased more often than not, and actually not reporting the facts, and that these were civil rights violations and things like taking homes by force and things. I was like, these were basic violations. I don't agree with this. I had objections and I refused orders. And so as soon as 9/11 happened and I saw the way the media was dealing with it, I was like, okay, we're not being told what's really going on here. That was clear. I didn't know about a conspiracy of it up until I had seen Dylan's film. Dylan's film inspired me to basically do the same, and that's what started the Core of Curruption series for me. And I wanted to approach it basically going to every news outlet I could, getting official news sources so that nobody could say, well, where did your information come from? I'm saying, look, here's the news report. This is cited. And my film targeted foreign intelligence involved in the attacks in some way, shape, or form. And I got a lot of reviews that were, attacking, because I was not scared to look at possible Israeli intelligence, foreknowledge or further, of 9/11. And I come from a Jewish family, and so for me, I got a lot of slack from family and friends, and I also got attacked. So it was like, it's to this day, I've actually been at the forefront of that, and on the internet they're like, oh, I'm a Mossad agent and all this stuff, and it's like, look, I'm flattered that I would ever be accused of such a thing. It's preposterous. But it's scary too, because these things aren't true, and people do believe anything they read on the internet. And if somebody out there really thinks that, I'm kind of freaked out about it. So one of the reasons I shut down my websites and got away from everything was because it had reached a tipping point a couple of years ago when I was doing legitimate journalism, and I was starting to get mainstream recognition. And at that time in my life, it was very odd for me. And I didn't sell out. I didn't, go against any of my beliefs or interests. I just chose to take a hiatus, walk away, take a breather. And so one of the reasons why I'm out here in Los Angeles is trying to still find what the next step is for me, if I want to go back to that life, if I want to go into film production, or, wherever it's going to go from here. But as Tyrell was saying earlier before the show started, was, how do you get away from the branding that we have, Well,
I don't think there's any reason to get away. I mean, at the end of the day, we are living in an environment that's been shaped by the war on terror, the idea of a global empire, and all the consequences that come with it, including economic collapse. We would say, I would say, reckless fiscal policy in terms of military spending, unnecessarily having bases all over the world to justify the idea of stopping terrorism. So that's why I go back to this 9/11 being such a critical event to reassess and really understand. It's like the Kennedy assassination was for that generation. This is the Reichstag fire, and are we going to let the Nazis continue to hold power, as I believe I call, essentially the Democrats and Republicans are what the Nazis would have been in the 1930s and 40s.
One of the things I was going to ask you, Dylan, is and both of you, when you were, you kind of were alone to a certain extent when you were doing your research at that time and things like that, and I was curious just to kind of how was your mindset doing that? You're kind of looking into something that all the world is saying it's going in this direction, and all of the hype and all of the media and all that is all going in this direction, and then you're kind of over here alone, I would assume, kind of saying, well, wait, there was a few other good people out there questioning it, around the time it happened, things like that, but really you're kind of all alone. And I was just curious, how was that as a researcher and as a filmmaker?
It
It was interesting, to say the least, and I had to be very cautious about who I spoke with about it in my circle of friends and family. I was a lot of things, I guess I was a little bit scared, I was a little bit nervous, I was like, is this the right thing? I don't want to say I questioned whether or not I was right, but I just simply questioned whether or not, I don't know, it really is tough to describe, and it's over a decade ago, so I'm really trying to bring myself back to that spot. But yeah, and that's why I really, even writing the feature, before I even knew that there was any kind of a cover-up to speak of, even then I was very nervous, and that's why I was like, I really need to research this and see if there's any truth to this kind of thought in the back of my head.
Do you remember, in terms of what researchers or material was available to you that you could draw upon?
I mean, it was definitely Paul Thompson's Terror Timeline. I don't know if it was originally called that. In fact, I think it was the complete 9/11 timeline, and then eventually they branched out and became, the timeline expanded from 9/11 to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, pre-9/11 events, etc. But for me, and I think for a lot of people, that was the first comprehensive, somewhat official source of information, because everything on there was hyperlinked to the news source, and every bit of information had 2, 3, 5, sometimes 10 articles linked within it. So you found this piece of information, then you found it backed up on CNN, MSNBC, The Guardian, what have you. So I think for a lot of people that was the big resource, and it's still up to this day, thankfully. So it was just, it was seeing all the contradictions and seeing all the stories that didn't line up, and the fact that the government didn't want an investigation at all. They were vehement about it. They're like, this is going to be investigated, if anything, by a congressional committee, and we don't think that we've done anything wrong here, so why should there be an investigation? And thankfully, the family members, the family steering committee, and the Jersey girls fought and fought and fought, and they finally got that investigation, which again turned out to be flawed in itself.
Even the investigative committee, I actually have a friend who was in the FBI at that time.
Really? On the Pentagon investigation, or
no, in the 9/11 investigation, the actual committee that was investigating 9/11, the official congressional investigation. I mean, she wasn't part of the committee, but as FBI,
gotcha.
She actually wrote part of the report, and she told me, for a long time I kept bugging her, usually through text or whatnot. I know this is an inside job. This is not the situation. This is not. There's no way that three buildings were brought
let me
down
ask you,
by
Sean.
two planes.
What you asked them, let me ask you. When the event happened, did you immediately kind of think something was afoot in your own life, or
Well,
I mean, we both have very. Your father dealt with.
I'll finish the story first, and then I'll go into that. But essentially, when I finally asked her in person, and I said, "Come on, we know this is an inside job." And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Why did you lie to me this whole time?" She's like, "I'm not going to tell you on a text that
I'm going to leave a paper trail."
Yes, it's we know it was an inside job, but you have to. There's just within layers of power, and you cannot go against that. You have to basically work within what you're given, and to present the story that's official. That's why the passport showing up in Muhammad Atta after a plane has been obliterated and in such a heat, such a temperature that brings down a building, and yet somehow his passport survives that, and even the black box doesn't. And you have to go, well, obviously FBI said they found that, and the New York Police Department said they found it, so it's part of the cover-up. But that's the official line. When you know these people personally, sometimes they'll open up and tell you things. For my part, it was interesting because I came back from Somalia in 2001. I'd been working there over the summer, and when you're abroad, you hear Osama bin Laden's name more frequently. He was a known entity. Al-Qaeda, these terror threats were known about. And there had actually been some travel advisory warnings about terror threats. I remember even being warned because I was in a region of Somalia that was more stable, but they were still warning people, in that region that's sensitive. When I came back, of course, the attacks happened, and yet I wasn't surprised by it, because when you know the rest of the world and you understand that we've been declaring war on countries illegally since the end of World War II, during the Cold War, and it's been constant, small incidences. People kill, hundreds of thousands of people killed in different countries over the course of these 50+ years, and Americans just don't realize it. So when you say that Americans can be killed as blowback, that's certainly one possibility. I think there was too much self-censorship going on in the air to ever question it right immediately after 9/11 that who had an inside job, if Bush had actually been involved, or not even Fahrenheit 9/11, which was a good documentary to implicate how Bush took advantage of 9/11, didn't want to go so far as to dare say that there was an inside job, because at the end of the day, it's very hard to know who did it, right? I mean, even with the Kennedy assassination, you can say, well, we're pretty
Here's-
sure
here's what
Oswald
might have been,
didn't
yeah.
do it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you know, you still have to be careful and implicate certainly anyone because we just don't have the evidence at hand. So from my point of view, I was, especially from the point that a friend of mine said, you know, his contacts in Mossad were definitely saying it's inside. Don't take any of this as real. It is it's a magic trick, basically. The whole incident, once he realized 2 buildings being taken down, I'm sorry, three buildings
Three
being
buildings being taken down.
obliterated, dissolved,
Yeah.
completely dissolved, right, from 2 planes. The idea of the Pentagon being hit by a plane that was making a 180-degree dive bomb that no one could pull
Speeds
off.
you couldn't do,
You know,
yeah.
even President Mubarak of Egypt was saying that's an impossible thing to maneuver to be made. The destruction of the black boxes were just too many holes that any thinking person could not question.
And
that.
then, you know, I always go back, you know, when my father was in office and, he served in the military and things like that, you always look for changes in standard operating procedure. Is usually a good sign that something's different, because it's generally they don't change their operating procedure very often. And when they change the phone call to scramble planes to going to Rumsfeld's office, the Pentagon, rather than the base commanders, that's kind of a big, like, okay, why would you change that suddenly? You know, I think it was like 6 months before it happened. So, you know, when you look at little things like that, that's
The
where
NORAD operation.
the NORAD and things like that.
Right.
I remember for me it was interesting because at the time I was working for Sean Penn, and I didn't think twice about 9/11 until the Iraq War suddenly drumbeat started. And I was like, well, wait, that doesn't make much sense because they had nothing apparently to do with it, you know. And then that's kind of, you know, from growing up, you know, with my dad and studying the JFK thing and knowing kind of how the operations work, that we'll do something over here to allow us to get into something over here. That's kind of when I started piecing it together. That's when I came across your film. And what was interesting for me is I had to go back and actually use your film to educate my father on it, because me and him actually got into a lot of arguments during that time.
That's funny.
And it was like, just watch the movie, and there's stuff that is, you know, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but there's a good general core to what you guys were doing that made sense to me. You know, from all the years I'd studied JFK and things like that, there were little things I was like, okay, I don't know about that, but the general direction of what you guys had made a lot more sense to me than what I was being told on TV. You know, and that's kind of when I suddenly switched and was like,
He initially bought the line that it was a foreign attack.
He initially, when it happened, he did, because my dad is a former military man. So initially, his first reaction is going to be, you know, okay, who attacked us, why, and then let's go get them. And then it was kind of arguments a lot back and forth. And then when the Iraq kind of thing push came, and he kind of suddenly saw, like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make much sense. That's when kind of the doorway opened for me to say, well, look, it's a lot like JFK. You know, and then when I was able to kind of start throwing in this information, because when I was working for Sean Penn was a big, you know, anti-Iraq war guy, and so he kind of opened me up to the bullshit about, you know, us going into Iraq after all this, and so it's kind of like that's how I kind of came around to it. But
You know, there's something funny about you mentioning how it's a lot like JFK. A researcher, Daniel Hopsicker, a good friend of mine, I highly recommend if you guys haven't. Are you familiar with his work? I followed that. I guess you could say that line of investigation. And when I was down in Florida and I was around the airfields where Otto was training, and you go there and you see exactly what was going on in Venice and that whole region.
Venice, Florida.
Yeah.
Venice, Florida.
Yeah, Hopsicker wrote the book, The Flying Ring, like the Muhammad
Muhammad
Atta,
on
the Venice.
the flying circus.
The flying circus.
Yeah.
And he's done amazing work since then, just investigative work online. But you know, the runners during the Iran-Contra period, you know, the sheriff down there of this county pulled me out. He goes, "You see all this? This is where they, all those guys in the Kennedy movie, all those anti-Castro Cubans, this is where they were taking off and landing." And I'm like, Atta's here training?
We're saying there's a continuation. There's a continuous
that's
lineage.
an awfully interesting. Yeah.
So the lineage was that those were the Bay of Pigs guys when they were training for the Bay of Pigs operation, right, against to overthrow Castro. They were training down there. Then during Iran-Contra, they were flying dope,
On these exact airfields.
right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, that was the whole point about Atta's operation is that the CIA have a facility right.
Well, and
What do
down
they
the
say?
street,
Work with
right?
who you know. So.
Well, and Daniel Hopsicker did great work at exposing that Marwan al-Shehi was probably his bodyguard. They were probably heroin drug runners, without getting into too much detail, because a lot of these figures that I would be mentioning are still out there. perceived as possible drug runners and connected to cartel members. But you know, if he was a heroin drug runner that Hofstadter believed to have uncovered this history, he was making all these flights between Venezuela and Brighton Beach, and the people that would have covered him would have been the biggest national security threat to the United States, because the black market, as we would say, the drug market, obviously those drugs are shipped in and people look the other way. Well, and I'm just throwing out a hypothetical, whether it's a foreign or domestic entity on top that's behind the attacks, if the method to get these guys in was to use protection from the black market people who are like, oh, these guys are drug runners, let them in. And then on 9/11, they see that and they see those names. The immediate reaction of anyone who helped those guys out, maybe they didn't know that these guys were going to be involved in terrorism, and so they just don't want to be associated because they're involved in something else, like drug running. And so Hofstadter was like, you know, a lot of this behavior of cover-up might be because somebody knew that the behavior was going to be to cover up anything related to something else.
We
and he
know
made a good point.
The nature of black operations is very much tied between illegal drugs trafficking, because it's a tremendous money maker, right? It flows into Wall Street, and then that is also used for the black operation side. That's not necessarily under the budgetary purview of Congress, right? So that's why historically the CIA, NSA, and other even more secretive operations. I mean, sorry, you would say like there's basically potentially a black government, like a shadow government in place, right? And it needs financing from what? From things that are on the underground
You can't go
markets.
to Congress and say we need to assassinate this guy. You have to find the money to do that elsewhere.
Exactly.
Right, and not even I mean,
Well,
you would
what I
essentially
mean, yeah.
say that, you know, as we know from JFK, when people said, you know, the mafia, is it the mafia that did it or the government that did it? When you don't realize that the CIA and mafia are essentially married, and that's why the mafia is allowed to operate, because they generate tremendous amounts of revenue, and it goes through the shadow markets, it goes through offshore accounts. And so there's a marriage, you know, at these levels where you would utilize someone who, as you said, if Otto, for example, was a heroin trafficker who has relationships to the intelligence community, he's then utilized for this operation, whether or not he even realizes what he's doing. He may be just doing, maybe taking a flight, thinking that he has to get to a destination, because as we know, we're not quite sure what happened to those planes. It doesn't seem to me that two incompetent pilots were able to navigate and crash into those buildings at that kind of speed, right? There's been a lot of talk.
Transponders off too.
Exactly.
So a lot of their
Turn the
equipment
transponders
wouldn't have
off.
been communicating.
And not only
Yeah.
that, but all 4 of the pilots that were supposedly flying those flights never punched in the hijack code. It's a
Correct.
4-digit code you can hit into the transponder, which immediately signals a hijacking. 4 pilots, one morning, none of them hit it. And
We talk more about, I mean, now we're talking about the idea of being able to hijack a car. When the Michael Hastings death, they said, oh, we had electronics to hijack a car. But this was known back in 2001 that there was something, I think it was called Global Hawk, which is an ability to actually to take over electronics of a plane as well, and remotely pilot the plane, which would make much more sense to me as to make sure that you hit the target than, as I said, 2 guys trying to steer a plane into what you think of the World Trade Center as a big building, but when you're going, 300, 400 miles an hour, it becomes very increasingly small and difficult to hit.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's interesting. One thing I want to ask you guys is when you released your various films and they kind of obviously became extremely iconic, how did that affect your lives? I mean, it sounds like a stupid question, but I think it's very interesting to think about. You guys, you did all this research, and then for both of you did all this research, you're questioning all this, and you're going totally against the grain of where society says you should be going. What was the trepidation like to put it out? Like, what was that like, and then what was the blowback from that?
Well, Dylan and I were talking about this when I first got out here to Los Angeles, about how he was, at one point I think I was running the blog for Loose Change, but he stayed on the Loose Change thing, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to create a website called newworldorderreport.com. And I was kind of doing the Alex Jones InfoWars thing. And so I took my documentary, and because I had been bombarded by people asking me about anything and everything going on in the news, and I was like, I don't know, let me look into it. And so I started that website as just kind of a conspiracy theory pop culture review site. And that's what I had done for maybe, I'd say, 5 years, maybe roughly, 4 years maybe. And for me, I reached a peak to being called into Clear Channel, various radio shows in Denver, and my work being featured at one point in David Icke's book, and it started getting some notoriety. And Clear Channel saw that I was reaching 20 to 22 million people every month, of a demographic that was by far, radical foreign or radical domestic, anti-corporate, anti-government. It was a demographic they can't capture. And the people at Curruption were like, look, this is a demo we could use. Would you like to come in? And I was a young kid like, yeah, sure, I'll do whatever, get me in, well, whatever, And I didn't understand at the time what I was getting myself into and what I was being invited to take part of. And as soon as I got there, it happened very quickly that I started doing and being put in very dangerous situations of investigative journalism. And my life in a 3-month period went from conspiracy theory and all that guy's crazy to the New York Times and the Washington Post mentioning my work, and very interesting characters making themselves known in my life. And I chose to shut all my websites down and walk away and take a breather. So for me, the films led to that. And I'm still in that kind of mix.
Well, you had an up close and personal view of the corruption at governmental levels of power with the Sullivan case.
Yeah, the Sullivan story was, I'd say that's the biggest story I've done.
Can you walk us through the Sullivan story a little bit?
The shortest way for me to tell the story is basically, he was Sheriff of the Year in 2001, and Colorado has the largest jail named after him, the Patrick Sullivan Detention Center. And he was a famed sheriff. He was personal friends with H.W. Bush. He was in the Clinton administration on a meth task force. He personally invited the Pope out in 1992 for World Youth Day. So he was famous, and he was infamous. And he was such a nice guy, highest ranking Jesuit in the country. And a lot of people had contacted me while working for Tom Martino, the troubleshooter in Denver, who basically anyone can call in with any problem if they don't trust government or if they don't have money for a lawyer, whatever they call him. And I was working as an investigative journalist for him. And I received this call, and this person said that they were a sex slave being held against their will, and that they had reached me, and that they had seen basically my work, and they didn't trust anyone else. And immediately after the phone call, there were people who came to me and was like, look, you're in a unique position to go into this. We can't find these people. We need you to go into this. And 6 weeks later, in that course of 6 weeks, I uncovered that it was the ex-sheriff Patrick Sullivan, connected to possibly 3 homicides, who I still believe is deeply connected to these 3 homicides. At one point, a young boy was found buried in a suitcase underneath a kiddie pool. Really dark stuff. Yeah. And he was distributing meth to underage males in exchange for sex. And one of the young males was an ex-porn star from out here who he hired as a security guard at Cherry Creek School District. And 2 weeks later, the security guard was fired for dealing meth at the school and taking kids to these private parties. And then Sullivan abruptly left his job as head of security, which the school says they don't know anything. And it's like, sure, this guy just quit his great job. So there was all these other political implications of whose jobs was I putting at stake. But their failure to investigate this guy because of this famed and scary position he had, being connected to all these people, I believe contributed to more deaths and more turmoil. So I wasn't scared. And as you guys know, I was coming from a very interesting demographic. I wasn't a journalist, I wasn't military, I wasn't cop. I was just a conspiracy blogger who thought I was a tough guy, and I was like, I'm going after him. Yeah. And I had no idea that it would turn out the way it did until the 6 weeks into it, when the FBI is doing a 22-person task force, and they're calling me in and they're putting a wire on me and putting me in a vest, and they're like, all right, we need you to go into this room, and we think we got, and I'm like having this epiphany, like, what am I doing? I'm not trained for this. I'm not a cop. I'm not military. And I just kind of had, I would say, a mix of anxiety and like, this is where my life's going to go, which I didn't have any negative feelings about it, but I don't know if that's really what I signed up to do. I was just trying to expose corruption and go after bad people. And when the story broke, obviously he got a plea deal. The prosecution in Arapahoe County was like, we're not touching this case. And so Governor Hickenlooper took over and put the Attorney General on it, and they brought out 2 people from the CIA. I found out he was in Cuba in 1960. He was the state's #1 demolitions expert. There's probably a reason he was friends with HW. So there were like career CIA analysts coming to me like, you have no idea who you're messing with.
Sullivan was in Cuba in 1960.
He was a young boy. He's like 18 at the time.
Yeah. Well, you see, I mean, you see where these people say conspiracy theorists are crazy, and yet you see in these characters someone who's high-level Jesuit, who was CIA, connected connected to H.W. Bush, in the Clinton administration, on the meth task force, and yet simultaneously, as we so often see, right, the guys who are supposed to be enforcing the law are not always, but oftentimes using that power to to corrupt it and take advantage. And then you get the child sex slavery, which was oftentimes implicated.
Which that ring busted because of the story.
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of allegations of satanic rings or whatnot. I'm not sure if he's into Satanism too, but I'm not with the Jesuits. With the Jesuits, you never know.
I mean, and I got emails for that. Every single person in the state who had anything to say about the sheriff contacted me with everything from people saying, "Oh, he planted stuff on my brother, and my brother's in his jail," and you don't dip your foot in the water if you're not a swimmer. So he was sheriff for 30 years. We don't know how deep that rabbit hole went, and without getting into too much detail, I was called into an office and asked to sign an NDA by people, and they were like, "Listen, you're in way over your head, kid. You can't prove what people are telling you about, and we don't want you to look any further." And it was a very interesting experience for me because, as Martino had advised me before in the past, most of the time the police do the sting, they tell the press controls what they tell the people. Very rarely the media does the sting, which is what he was good at, and then the police have to work with the media on what do we keep the people from knowing too much because it might be an active investigation. We don't want any other witnesses or bad people to do anything. Almost never an inexperienced conspiracy blogger holds all the cards, walking around with hidden cameras, and both the media and the government are looking at him like, "All right, everybody, what is he going to do?" And he's like, "You really scared everybody."
Well, you're lucky you survived it.
Well, Dylan, what about you? Like, how did you went through how many different editions of Loose Change?
4 in total.
About 4 in total.
Yeah.
And it became this kind of global phenomenon.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people would even say that kind of helped basically start the truther movement, if you want to use that term. How did that affect your life? I mean, did you ever imagine it was going to be that when you finished?
Well, it's funny, when the first edition came out on April 13th, 2005, I was waiting tables at Red Lobster. When that shipment of the first 1,000 DVDs showed up at my house, I thought that was it. Like, I thought that I was going to eventually move all of those and that people would get bored or they'd move on to something else and then that would be it. I mean, I was just like, oh, well, I made this movie and maybe I'll sell some copies and get back to my life. And that was really about it. And it was when, we got, we sold that 1,000 and then we put in the order for the next 1,000 and then KPFK out here in LA wanted to use the film for their summer fun drive, and then before we knew it, we were being flown out to LA. Spent 2 weeks driving around and doing all these little screenings at churches and various venues. No theaters yet because it hadn't quite reached that level of acceptability where theater owners were allowing those films under their roofs. So really it was like churches and community centers and things like that.
You must have had interactions with the people at that point. What kind of reactions were you seeing?
It was interesting, like a lot of it was like, thank you guys, like we're glad that someone's finally doing this, that there's a film that we can sit down and all watch together and because I think one of the main themes from a lot of the feedback we got over the years was that I've always been trying to convince people, like your story with your dad, it's like I've been trying to convince people about this for years, and every time I try to talk to them about it, they just walk away. So now I can just hand them a DVD and they can watch it on their own time. And that was kind of my whole approach, because I got sick of trying to, I don't want to use the word lecture because it's the wrong word, but I got sick of trying to explain myself to people and try to okay, what's the best information I can bring up to them? All right, what should I bring up that's gonna really hit them on a personal level? And I got kind of tired of doing that. So I was like, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And I'd been interested in film since high school. I started editing music videos at age 13. I took visual arts classes in high school, so I was already kind of working in that direction. So I was, and then with the narrative film slowly evolved into the documentary. It was still kind of that mentality of, what's the best way to reach people? What's the best way to get this information out? And especially, what's the best way to do it without preaching or without hammering people over the head with it, which I found was the fault with some of the other 9/11 films that were out at the time, was that they were too preachy and in your face, and this is what you have to believe or you're a sheeple.
You were asking the right questions.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Was there ever any information that you decided to hold back or left, or just felt that it was too controversial?
Oh yeah, I mean, from the first and the second edition, we took out the whole pod missile, thing under the second plane thing. That was kind of the other thing.
Whether it was a missile that hit the
yeah, and that was some research I got sucked into in 2004, and it was kind of crazy and interesting at the time, but I mean, you learn very quickly like what's good information and what's bad information, and what is based off of grainy video and what's real. And it was, the 4 editions have been a streamlining of that, and like, all right, what's working and what isn't, and let's get rid of the stuff that isn't. And it was always about listening to our feedback, listening to our criticisms, and trying to acknowledge those, and like look, we've never claimed to be perfect, we've never claimed to know anything. These are just movies. So take the information.
I think that was one of the unfair criticisms that you guys got, was kind of like, well, they said this in this version, and then they changed their minds in this version, and all of that. So clearly, do
we still use old history books?
Yeah,
I mean,
and that's the thing that kind of drove me up the wall when I read reviews of that nature, because I was like, well, wait a minute, these guys aren't, they're going by the seat of their pants from what I could tell. I mean, you're doing good research, but it's not like you spent your whole life dedicated to do this one thing.
Yeah.
You want to be a filmmaker, that was it. You didn't set out to say, I'm going to make this amazing documentary. You set out to answer questions for yourself and things like
exactly.
that.
You almost had the support of people like Charlie Sheen. I mean, what ultimately happened with that situation?
Oh, with Charlie Sheen, I mean, the second edition went viral, and of course we started getting offers from people who wanted to like buy it. We got a letter in the mail from one producer, one of the guys who worked on Ali, I think. He wanted to buy the rights for the entire series for $1 million, like up front, and we said no, because he wanted to own it. And we were like, that's not going to happen. Sorry, man. Appreciate it. $1 million sounds nice, but not for what you want. And it was never about money, and it was never about selling out, so to speak. So we were like, sorry, man. But there were these 2 producers who got in touch with us from out here in Hollywood, and they were like, listen, we just want to fly you guys out here. We know some people that we can go have some meetings with, and one of them had worked for New Line, the other one had done some other work in the industry. So we were like, screw it. I mean, let's go out to LA and just see what happens. So that was, I think that was late 2006, because the second edition had been out all year. We were kind of working on a 3rd edition on the side, and we were thinking about it, but we weren't really sure if that's what we wanted to do. Because we were like, do we just want to make another film on the internet? It's like, let's try and do something bigger. Let's try and get it into theaters. And then that's when these producers materialized, and we're like, let's help you make that happen. So the very short version of the story is that we were negotiating a deal with 2929 Films, Magnolia Pictures, Mark Cuban's company. We had gotten put in touch with Charlie Sheen through Alex Jones. So we went to his house, and Mark Berg, the producer of 2.5 Men, came over, and we all watched some of the second edition in Charlie Sheen's private screening room, and he made us popcorn and everything, and it was a really cool experience. But then, of course, the news of the deal got leaked to the New York Post, and before we knew it, the phone calls with 2929 stopped getting answered, and the mutual contact of Charlie Sheen, because we were never actually talking directly to Charlie, Charlie's friend eventually told us that Charlie was no longer interested in doing the film. I mean, we met Charlie Sheen maybe twice, once at his house and once on the set of 2.5 Men. And once the deal fell apart, we had,
was it Mark Cuban also at one point?
Yeah, I mean, 2929, that was the company that was supposed to be distributing it.
Didn't he personally make a statement about your film too?
He made a statement after the New York Post came out where he was like, I support people's right to express themselves, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with the film.
So what do you think? I mean, that's just curious to me, because you feel that because it got leaked in advance, that it scared them off. But if they had purchased the rights, they would have had to face the media backlash sooner or later.
So I don't really know what was going on there. I mean, sure, I would like to think that they would have prepared themselves for that eventuality, but maybe the reality of it didn't come, because the ink wasn't on the paper at that point, so they were still free to walk away with no consequences. And I think at that point it was a judgment call on their part.
How did you handle the criticisms? It was pretty, violent. I mean, there was. You got people kind of asking for your head on a stick, and you're a traitor, and all of that kind of thing. How does that affect you as a person?
You can only have so many perfect strangers telling you to die before it really starts to worm its way into your skull and really cause some serious mental issues. So I was ready to walk away, after not too long. I mean, I was just like, I can't do this for the rest of my life. And much like John, I started running into very interesting or just dangerous individuals, and just like you, I'm a Mossad agent, I'm a disinformation agent, I'm working for the other side. I mean,
I was called everything I think you can be classified, from a Republican to a Democrat to a redneck to a hippie I was like, what am I then?
Which is funny, because I've tried to be nothing but completely transparent about who I am and where I come from. If I released a film under a pseudonym and I never did press and I never told people where I was from, then they might have a leg to stand on. But I'm like, look, I'm this kid from upstate New York. I was waiting tables when the film came out. I'm just a dude, you know, like that's all I am. I'm just a filmmaker, really, is all it's ever come down to.
And that's when they always come back and they're like, well, that's exactly what they would want you to believe.
It's the perfect cover-up now, isn't it?
It doesn't matter to what extent.
So,
I mean, once you entertain these.
But it was like, it became apparent it was a lose-lose situation for me, because even if I keep trying to do the right thing and I keep putting out these films, you know, I think the movement kind of hit a wall in like 2006, 2007, because I don't know if you guys remember, but on the 5-year anniversary, we got about 3,000 people to show up in New York City from all across the country, handed out like 10,000 free t-shirts, 600 DVDs, and I mean, we literally took over Lower Manhattan. I mean, you couldn't walk anywhere near the World Trade Center without seeing an Investigate 9/11 shirt. Yeah, kind of like that, but I think a year or two. That's like 2007 or 2008,
yeah,
but like that. So that, but much bigger and with a lot more people. That was, I don't want to say that's when we jumped the shark, but I think that was the peak, because, you know, 2006 was the year of Loose Change 2nd edition, because our big, well, first of all, we got, before the film was even technically done and released, we got interviewed by WICZ Fox in Binghamton, New York, and that went all over the country, all over the world, actually. In fact, their servers got crashed, and the story went down, so of course, WICZ started getting emails from people saying, oh, did you guys get pressured by the government? Did you guys have to take down the stories? Like, what's going on? And it was just, they were getting so much traffic to those stories that it crashed not not two, but all 3 of their servers. So, people couldn't believe it. They were like, these guys are on a Fox affiliate talking about 9/11 being an inside job. What's going on here? And even right then, people were like, who are these guys? Come on, this is staged. This isn't real. But that was the beginning. That was the snowball that started rolling downhill, was the WICZ appearance. And then from there, we got on Air America. We were in Hustler. We were in Vanity Fair. We were all over the place. I mean, 2006 was our year. And then after the 5-year anniversary, and we got 3,000 people to show up in the city, it was like, this isn't going to happen again.
Well, where do you go from there?
Where do you go from there?
Did you ever get contacted by any insiders in the sense of giving you some tips or you know, some things that you hadn't expected to hear? Let's say.
You know, it's funny.
Had to have been.
I didn't. For a majority of the Loose Change years, I didn't really get a lot of insiders. I got a lot of people who were claimed to be insiders or claimed to have information, but upon some simple prodding, it was pretty clear that they didn't really know much. But I did get some very interesting emails in late 2009. So, you know, way after Loose Change had come and gone.
Final Cut years.
Yeah, Final Cut, American Coup years, I think. It was after American Coup, because that was September. So I think right around that time, I started getting emails from this really interesting person over in Europe, who was essentially telling me, you know, like, you were on the right track, you know, like your thesis was a little off. But you were on the right track. And at first I thought it was just another email from just someone claiming to know something, and I kind of blew him off at the time. But the way he responded to me blowing him off, and kind of like, he was like, hey, you know, like that's your call. It's like, I'm coming to you with information and you can either accept it or not. And I was like, well, let me write back to him, you know, and like I kept poking and without saying too much, you know, pretty much said that 9/11 was a lot bigger than our own government, and that it wasn't just about things that the United States wanted to accomplish. There were things inside the buildings that people wanted destroyed. There were many factors at play, and it wasn't just about the Bush administration. And in fact, one of the things he said is that, you know, you were I don't know. I don't want to give away too much, and I don't want to say too much, but pretty much it was a very interesting exchange from a person who I did a background check on, and it seemed like he had the kind of, like, he works in oil over in Europe, so he definitely has that kind of access. He had a signed copy of a book from Arthur C. Clarke and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Well, there's new stuff coming out on, it's called Black 9/11 is the book, and I think there's even online on YouTube some stuff talking more about the history of the financial situation with Russia, having to do with bonds and the reason why certain floors were targeted at the World Trade Center for destruction. World Trade Center 7 being targeted because it was not only a CIA outpost, but there were other bureaus in there whose evidence was lost. The idea of, not just the idea, I'm pretty sure this is real, there was gold that was taken out of the World Trade Center during the attacks. That was actually spotted. So there was almost like an internal coup. Again, we talk about the shadow government, but that which is behind the scenes, which no one from the public would really ever have any hint to, was taking place, and it was being done in a very public spectacle. So the distraction really became Al-Qaeda and the war on terror, but there were many financial, I think, repercussions that took place around the event.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you had gotten some leads.
I would say after I had brought Dylan out for Final Cut premiere, and I had raised like $20,000 to make sure that these guys were. I paid for advertising on radio. I didn't pay to get them on radio. I paid for advertising on radio. And they got on all these interviews on radio, and we sold out every screening pretty much all around Boulder and Denver. And we got them in the paper, and it was a huge buzz in Colorado. We actually, that founded basically, at that point, the biggest thing that we were doing for the activists at that time to help build the stepping stones towards legalizing weed, believe it or not. Like we got a lot of people together. But I mean, at that time, Colorado's very interesting. It's one of the top 3 employment providers is the federal government, and there's all this talk about DIA and all that stuff, and I was basically trying to get them in front of everybody out there, and so I had a lot of very interesting continuity of government type figures who were contacting me and giving me like photos of what appeared to be a small plane painted to look like an American Airlines jet that was being transported at some military base in Colorado. And he's like, check this out. And I'm like, I don't know what you're doing right now, and I don't know what's going on. And I'm like looking at it, and I'm like, okay. And I took a photo with my cell phone, and I just, I sent it to everybody I knew, and I was like, I don't know what to do with this. This guy just came to me. So there was like those kinds of people, which you don't know what to do with these people. You don't necessarily want to, you don't want to entertain them too much, but you also don't want to, blow them off.
Just kind of store it in your data bank, because at the end of the day, you don't know if he's trying to, it could be misinformation to, to make you look bad if you publish it, but at the same time, it's stored away. Maybe it comes back, connects somewhere.
Yeah, and there was a guy that showed up at the, if you remember, this guy showed up at the screening, and he's like, you didn't get these from me. And he handed us photos, and it was photos that nobody had ever seen of the Pentagon. And he was a military photographer in and outside of the Pentagon, and we received, 200-something photos.
Was the Ingersoll photos?
I don't remember the name.
Yeah. And it was photos basically in the aftermath of whatever hit.
It was right after, yeah.
Yeah, that must be the Ingersoll photos.
There was no indication of any kind of plane in those photos.
And those were the photos that showed the Pentagon before the wall had collapsed. So if it weren't for those photos, we wouldn't have a lot of those photos that we do today.
Yeah, those were pretty damning photos.
Yeah. Well, all right, so let me ask you this, guys. Both of these, you both live these kind of extraordinary lives in your 20s. Where do you want to go now? Like, where is your lives taking you now?
I mean, for me, it's always just been about making movies, and that's all I'm trying to do now. So, I'm living in LA, I'm working on scripts, I'm shooting music videos and shorts, and I'm just trying to make movies. I mean, that's really all I ever wanted to do, and that's all I'd ever.
How has that been? Being that you're obviously very well known for this one particular movie.
Well,
does it harm you? I mean, do you feel like it's holding you back? Do you feel like it's pushing you forward? How has that been?
It's funny, I don't know if you guys saw, but I was interviewed by Alec Baldwin a while ago, and after the radio, he was talking to the engineer, because I was still over by the mic, and he was talking to the engineer, and he's like, there's been a lot of conversations in Hollywood where I'm standing around talking to people and talking about, it's like Dylan Avery is a hero, and I'm just like, I'm standing there listening to that, I'm like, I don't feel like a hero, I do, but I don't, because I feel like there's kind of this stigma where people respect what I did, but they don't want to hire me for anything, because they don't need a 9/11 conspiracy film made, so why would they hire me? It's that truism of you're only as good as your last film, and that was my last big film. So it's tricky, because there's obviously a lot of people in the industry that admire what I did and are aware of it and are aware of me as a person, but there's never that next step of, hey, let's see what he wants to work on next, or let's get him a budget for his next film. And it's like, it's been very tricky, because it's trying to somewhat use that notoriety without continuing it. And that's the other thing, is that was one of the things that always pissed me off about one of the many criticisms of Loose Change, is these guys are just trying to get famous. It's like, if I was trying to get famous, that's the last fucking subject I would make a film about.
That was completely organic. That was not.
Well, especially to spend your time on doing 4 or 5 editions or something. That shows a lot of tenacity.
Yeah, that's not something you do because you want to be famous. I mean, we really believe we were doing something right, and it really felt like this is something that has to be done, and these are films that need to be made, but it was never about, hey, let's get on the news, or hey, let's get rich and let's get this mansion. It was just like, people need to know this information. And unfortunately, I did get famous because of Loose Change, and that, hindsight is 20/20, and if I could change the past a little bit, maybe I would have, and maybe released it under a pseudonym, I don't know, and maybe I would be better or worse off now because of it, I don't know. And that's the thing about hindsight. So
I think doors are open for you. I mean, there's still, I think just from the people that I know in Denver, which aren't necessarily industry people compared to out here, but from the radio people and all the people that I know out there, they were more than receiving to work with you. And I think what it is it's like, I don't want to say starstruck, but you did something so powerful that people are like, whoa, let's see what he's going to do next. Less of they're going to come to you for something.
Well, don't discount the influence of government and essentially the intelligence industry shaping what's created in Hollywood. I mean, at the end of the day, there are people. There are plenty of it's liberal Hollywood, and yet most of the films that are made are pro-military, pro-U.S. government. Fearful of terrorism.
Well, you can't get a jet unless the army signs off on your script.
Exactly.
So at the end of the day,
you got the fallacy of Mark Bowl trying to say that I never cleared my script was completely independent of the CIA, Zero Dark 30. When you can't make that movie without the CIA helping you.
Sure. So what they'll do is they'll thank you for it, but then that's basically that's their thanks is only a thank you, and then you're not going to get anything else until you just do it yourself. I mean, that's why the independent cinema is growing so much, because people with voices can't go through the studio system to get anything.
What about you, Jonathan? Where are you going now after all this kind of amazing events happened in your life? Where would you like to kind of see?
I started out as a filmmaker. My passion is action and sci-fi films, and I've matured a lot of my beliefs, and I don't question or change a lot of what I started out doing. But I have a lot of different opinions today than I did years ago about things, about the world and the understanding of events. And my personal experience with the Sullivan story changed a lot of that maybe there is always something that we might not be able to see. And I was able to grasp how 9/11 might be able to happen without government involvement and things like that. Not saying that I believe that, I'm saying that now I look at things differently. Like maybe people plan for this step and then these people to find out and they design it for another step. And I dealt with people like that.
Well, I mean, do you mean like a shadow government? Is that what we're...
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good term. But yeah, I mean, it's, dealing with those people and seeing how they manipulate things like that. I would say, and I shouldn't say they, I should say, somebody who has a vested interest in remaining a silent position in a crime. And when you get a bunch of those people, especially when they're intelligent and they're highly educated and well trained, and they have access to historical operations that are not publicly known to learn from. Once I became aware of that there are people with access to that kind of stuff that are well financed, that are well trained, and do not want to be known, and they are connected to everything from drug running and things like that. And trying to go after some of these people, I realized this is not really my interest. I was never really interested in messing with these people. I was just trying to stop what I thought was, a human trafficking ring and things like that. So I didn't realize where it would lead. So I just the reason why I walked away and where I want to go is because it's not that I don't have my opinions about it. I still, obviously, I would love to stop all that stuff in the world, but I also want to be a filmmaker. So I have to be realistic about.
You're not Batman. You can't
right. I'm not
stopping real criminals that the government actually answers to. It's like who pays the government at the end of the day? Right?
Sometimes at the end of the day, I've always felt that being an artist and making something like that can also have even a more profound effect on shaping and helping direct society in a correct way than a million tons of investigative reporting. Sometimes, whether it's a movie or something like that, you can make that has a more profound effect than a million newspaper stories.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Dylan and I just, we're almost done of a script we're writing together about a very pivotal character in history. And these kinds of stories that him and I have come across, and in the areas where I want to go into writing and producing about characters in society who we're not really sure about, are they good or bad, but they lived these amazing lives that influenced so many people and nobody knows their names. And that's something I'm very passionate about, just to show people that there are figures in society that affect lives of millions, if not billions of people, and most people don't know their name above a whisper.
Well, the one thing I believe about 9/11, September 11th attacks in general, is that the silver lining to it is that people have woken up across the world. There's a new realization. You talk like the public lexicon. people like Tupac were talking about the Illuminati in the 90s, right? Now almost everyone references the Illuminati in some form or is aware of it, or some kind of conspiracy, deeper levels of corruption. There's a global awakening taking place of the people behind the scenes, and so we have to look at the event for the idea of a moment of shocking us into awareness, especially in terms of globalization, looking at the best aspects of it, that we're connecting through internet, through across countries as human beings, and being able to stand against perhaps this pernicious force that maybe has a negative agenda, but then like the dark side in a sense forces you to become light in a sense. It forces you to know who you are and where you stand, and if you're going to be on the good side or the bad side.
I have to say, you guys, thank you very much for joining us today.
Totally.
It was a fascinating interview and fascinating people.
Thanks for having us.
I
Appreciate it. Yeah,
please come back anytime. Let us know what's going on with your future movies and endeavors and things like that. Love to have you.
Cool.
Would you like to finish, or should I?
I think you should take it out.
Okay. I'm Tyrell Ventura, and this is a fascinating interview, and thank you all for watching today, and we'll catch you again on another episode of Buzzsaw.